Lincoln Riley making the comment. I mean, he said several things, but the snippet that really caught my attention is, he said, "We were behind. We've been behind," and it brings up the question, about the past 2 years, is that, like, did Lincoln Riley really know USC was behind the whole time? I mean, I know that, like, in terms of facilities, yeah, like that was still in progress. That wasn't some things had not been finalized. USC was certainly behind in some ways, but there's a part of me that's really angry at Lincoln Riley. If he's going to say, well, we were behind these past few years, like, it's not as though we were in the best position. And obviously, hiring Chad Bowden, was a central foundational element in engineering this turnaround. But Lincoln Riley saying, like, well, I knew we were behind all this time. Lincoln Riley did things to make sure that USC was behind. Alex Grinch being number one, but also, like, he did not seem to be moving or adjusting late 2023, early 2024, in terms of the awareness of what it took to get USC back to the standard. If anything, it seems as though Jen Cohen had to force Lincoln Riley to make certain adjustments. So if Lincoln Riley's saying, as he recently did, we've been behind, we were behind, as though, like, I was not placed in an ideal situation, there's a part of that seems to me Lincoln Riley trying to deflect blame to, like, I didn't have the right situation. No, Lincoln, you didn't create the right situation. So Ethan, pull that apart. Like, when Lincoln Riley says what he says, how much do you think it was just, what, he just didn't really read the industry, he wasn't reading the trends of where the business of college football was going? Or how much was it just, he's actually just kind of deflecting, and he was responsible for USC being behind? What's the balance between those two viewpoints?
Yeah, for sure. I just to give our watchers a little bit of context, you're referring to a tweet that I sent you a little bit earlier today that was tweeted out by Pete Nakos of On3, where he said USC has the #1 recruiting class in 2026. That's come together with the top NIL budget, but it's taken Lincoln Riley 3 years to get here, he tells at On3 Sports. We were very behind. More recruits want to come here because they see what's happening and they see that USC is... Sorry, I'm not seeing the last part of it. They see that USC is taking this seriously, that this is not one of those things where it's a bunch of hollow promises. So I think, first and foremost, yes, it's a little frustrating. I think Lincoln Riley probably missed a little bit how behind USC was, because Lincoln Riley himself wasn't behind. He was coming to USC at a time where he was very much ahead of a lot of the college football world, coming off of so many college football playoff appearances and developing Heisman quarterbacks. And he even brought over a guy who would win the Heisman the very first year here, and then brought over a lot of talent that was committed to Oklahoma. And so he, I think, probably felt like he could just kind of on his own take his Oklahoma program and kind of put it at USC. And then, because I mean, it's not an entirely crazy thing to think, especially if you're going to a place with similar culture. Like, if Nick Saban came out of retirement and was hired anywhere, it would become, Nick Saban football. It's not like Nick Saban would like change his ways entirely because he's coaching at the University of Washington or something. Like, he would do what he's been doing for so many years. I think, though, what the difference with Lincoln Riley is that he was a lot younger, and we've talked about how he inherited kind of the whole Bob Stoops setup at Oklahoma, where it was just, he was kind of handed a really great situation already. He didn't have to build that from the ground up necessarily. So he, maybe underestimated the work that it was going to take a little bit. So that's kind of one aspect of this. I think also something that this made me think of, because, a big emphasis in this tweet and in this article from On3 is the NIL budget. And I do think they probably got a big NIL boost after that first Lincoln Riley season that they didn't necessarily have before it, just because it's been, a decade and a half of mediocre USC football that fans were not very satisfied with. And fans don't want to just waste their money. And I think also, maybe fans had yet to see how directly their donations would affect getting some of these better players. And, in this new world of NIL, people weren't really sure how it worked. And so, maybe that had something to do with it, I suppose. And that is kind of what he's referring to here. I just think, yeah, it comes down to, I think, him being having a little bit of that smartest guy in the room syndrome that we've talked about, feeling a little bit like he was on top of the world after Oklahoma and not realizing, despite, some of USC's history, because I'm sure when they hired him too, they kind of hyped up USC's history a lot and talked about how this was a great place to win and how this was going to be a great place for NIL and all of that stuff. And he was like, oh, great. This is an incredible program. They're going to pay me, however many millions of dollars to come out here and buy me this incredible house. And it's just going to be, and I'll get to do something meaningful because I get to turn around the program a little bit, but all the resources are there. So it'll be easy. I'll just have to put things in place, or whatever. And that obviously was not the reality. And he needed a little bit more help than just taking Oklahoma and putting it at USC, because they're two very different places.
Do you think that, we've talked about Mike Bohn, being pushed out, he didn't resign. He didn't just leave of his own accord. He was pushed out for, inside the office, inappropriate behavior, professional decorum. And I know some USC fans think that was kind of bogus, but that point aside, I'm not trying to litigate or relitigate that point, but one thing we haven't talked about, Ethan, in terms of why USC was slow to respond to everything the past few years, which does play into Lincoln Riley being behind. Now, whether you blame Lincoln Riley for that or not, that's up for you to decide. But USC was behind. That is true. We're not debating that, because USC was just caught flat-footed for a couple years. We were all wondering. I did with Tim Prangley last year. Why is this house not in order? Well, the house is finally in order, but this was a multi-year restoration project. Shouldn't have had to happen at USC. But anyway, we've talked about Mike Bohn, Ethan. You and I have talked about it. You brought it up as a reason for why, and Jen Cohen needing to kind of get up to speed. She needed a year to acclimate to everything, and she finally, engineered the Chad Bowden hire, which has gotten things back on track finally at long last. But we haven't talked about Brandon Sosna. Didn't talk about him because he was Mike Bohn's right-hand man. And, so he didn't leave for any behavioral controversy. He went to the NFL. He just wanted to go in that direction, chart a new course in his career. How much can we assign not to Mike Bohn leaving in terms of these lost years of stagnation for USC? How much can we attribute to Brandon Sosna, and maybe, a Sosna Bohn Jen Cohen comparison? How does Brandon Sosna, in your estimation, fit into that larger picture, since that's a person we haven't really talked about over these past several weeks?
I think anytime you lose a guy who's high up in your program, it's going to have an impact, and you're going to have to figure out how to adjust. But yeah, when you lose two guys who are high up in your program, it's even more difficult because it's basically a complete overhaul. So I think that can explain some of the difficulties in 2023. But yeah, I think it's the fact that it's taken 2 years. I think if there would have been one down year, people would have been like, okay, 2022 schedule was easy. 2023's was a little bit more difficult. There was, just a lot of drop off on the offensive line, which turned into a big issue. And, but I think people got especially frustrated when USC was, kind of mediocre for a second consecutive year and was, especially losing some of those close games. And you can't really chalk you know, it's when you have bad luck in the fourth quarter so many times in a row, it starts to become a pattern instead of a coincidence. So I think that became really frustrating. But yeah, I think it's the transition period is something that you could use as an excuse if it was a 1 year, but once it starts to become 2 years, it's a little bit too long perhaps for that to be the sole reason or the main